On January 14th, 1963, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel gave the speech, Religion and Race, at a conference in Chicago. There he met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the two of them became friends. 2 years later, Heschel would walk with Dr. King at Selma. At that conference, he said that at the first conference of Religion and Race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast for me." While Pharaoh retorted, "Who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but it is far from having been completed. This Shabbat, our Torah narrative details this confrontation as we remember Martin Luther King Jr. Pharaoh, the archetype of suffering, the oppressor, will not heed the words of Moses to free the Israelites from bondage. Pharaoh only increases their labor and compounds their suffering. The oppression of the Israelites is so severe that they cannot see a way out of their suffering. Moses, as the mouthpiece of God, stands between Pharaoh and the Israelites, between the oppressor and the oppressed, demanding freedom and demanding justice. When Pharaoh does not hear the plea for justice, God steps in with a series of plagues that wreak havoc on Egypt. Pharaoh is stubborn and with a hardened heart does not recognize the plight of the slaves. Pharaoh sees himself as a god and does not recognize the God of the Hebrews, Yud-He-Vav-He, the breath of all life that permeates all of existence. This is a very tense moment for Moses, witnessing the pain of the oppressed and the indifference of the oppressor, unsure of how to uncover a path through. The first plagues that fall on the land, blood in the Nile, frog infestation, are mimicked by Pharaoh's magicians, and so Pharaoh still remains separate, unconvinced. However, Moses and Aaron, through God, are able to reverse the plagues, take them away, something Pharaoh's magicians cannot do. And this gives Pharaoh pause, only briefly. A close reading of the Hebrew in this week's text will unearth parallels to the story of creation in Genesis. And the plagues here are a symbolic undoing of creation. Moses is trying to demonstrate to Pharaoh that if he keeps up this suffering state, this power-hungry, oppressive leadership, he will break this world and it will fall apart. Pharaoh, don't you recognize that you are part of the whole and the injustice and suffering you propagate will destroy all of us? Increasing suffering causes disunity, and disunity breeds destruction. In the face of suffering, Dr. Martin Luther King, from his "I've been on the mountaintop" speech, reminds us that we've got to stay together and maintain unity. You know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula for doing it. King teaches us. What was that? It kept the slaves fighting among themselves. But whenever the slaves got together, something happens in Pharaoh's court, and he cannot hold the slaves in slavery. When the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. Now let us maintain unity. We continue Moses' fight today. We continue Martin Luther King Jr.'s fight today. We honor the legacies of Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose yhartzeit was only a couple weeks ago, and Martin Luther King, both of them friends, who stood up in the face of injustice and cried out for unity. Both of them believed that God is affected by human deeds, and both rejected Aristotle's influential insistence that God is unaffected by human beings, an unmoved mover. On the contrary, God is the most moved mover, both men used to say. That is the lesson of the prophets, that God cares deeply about the human beings and is pained by humans' act of injustice and cruelty. We are called today to listen to our text, to hear the cry of the oppressed, then and now, to heed the words of Heschel and King, to face the oppressors, to listen, respond, and act. When we don't, we cause God pain. We don't have to wait to reach the mountaintop. We don't have to wait for Mount Sinai to meet God. God is right there in between Moses and Pharaoh, in the confrontation, in the dialogue. This showdown in Egypt is happening within ourselves and within our society now. God is right there within us as we balance living a life of joy and suffering, living a life where we continually learn about the power of unity, about the power of justice. God is right there with us when we stand up for the other. At every turn, we possess the opportunity for a consciousness shift. We are free to fall into the grips of Pharaoh, and we are free to resist it like Moses. It begins with perspective. How do you wish to see the world? What kind of world do you want to live in? Answering these questions help us direct our actions. You see, when I read the text this week, whether the plagues actually happened or not is not the question that my life seeks to discover. That's not the question I pose. The question that the biblical narrative evokes and challenges in me is whether I can discover the miraculous in the mundane. When I can bring together all of the parts, all the peoples, all the genders, all of the races, and see us all as one beautiful whole. A whole that cannot thrive without everyone seeing this perspective. When we can look at reality through this lens, we can see all life teeming with God, every particle sacred, every individual holy. How can injustice in all of its forms thrive when we see a world like this? How can our oppressors survive when we all see and live in this wonder? This is how Heschel asks us to view the world. This is how Moses seeks to teach Pharaoh to see, so that he may cease to increase suffering. It's what Heschel calls radical amazement. He says our goal should be to live life in radical amazement. Get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed. Radical amazement as a spiritual practice. How do we live this life? How do we teach Pharaoh to as well? We must believe that we are all one family, and living in that unity is the path to justice. That what affects one of us affects all of us. If anything, that's what this pandemic has been teaching us. Our Talmud sets upon us a lofty goal when it says, anyone who is able to protest against the transgressions of the entire world and does not, is punished with the transgressions of the entire world. We must all continue to learn to identify with the plight of others around the world. Heschel teaches us when we hear and accept what we hear without meeting others, without asking how can it be, without looking for friends outside of our circles, when we accept hatred for a group as a legitimate discourse, Pharaoh is alive and well inside ourselves. And Pharaoh must not be allowed to rule within us. We must continually practice expanding our circle, welcoming all, allowing our text to guide us there. My people were brought to America in chains, Martin Luther King Jr. teaches. Your people were driven here to escape the chains fashioned for them in Europe. Our unity is born of our common struggle for centuries. Not only to rid ourselves of bondage, but to make oppression of any people by others an impossibility. Through our text, Moses is teaching us about God, the potency of love that is the engine of the world, the spirit of compassion and justice upon which life is built. God is teaching us that within each and every one of us there is a Pharaoh and a Moses potential. We must recognize both of these energies, and God is waiting for us to choose whether to heed the voice of Pharaoh within or the voice of Moses, who will lead us out together. The voice of Pharaoh will keep us in a never-ending cycle of suffering, and this will translate to all of our actions. While heeding the voice of Moses awakens to the path of unity, recognizing all of us as aspects of the one. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Livracha, teaches us to love God is to recognize his image in a human face, especially one whose creed, color, or culture is different from ours. When we are able to see the face of God in all and lead from this truth, we will know that we can never be silent in the face of suffering, injustice, or oppression. I swore never to be silent whenever human beings endured suffering and humiliation. Eli Wiesel says, we must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. It begins by looking within, recognizing Pharaoh, confronting it, then turning to the Moses energy, allowing our text to harness it, and then birthing action. When Heschel marched with Martin Luther King in Selma, he said, for many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs even without words. Our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying. I pray that we continue to follow their footsteps, transforming our prayers and study into action. Our portion tonight places us right in the middle of the confrontation of Moses' liberation movement in the face of injustice, and I hear these words of Heschel and King reverberate throughout space and time. That injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all directly, he wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail. While Heschel states, morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. That indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. That in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. All the while, Moses is saying, still saying, let my people go. Shabbat Shalom.